I found a hidden sister after my father's death, family secrets uncovered, Reddit stories. It started with dust. Dust on my fingers, dust in the air, dust on memories I wasn't supposed to uncover. I wasn't looking for secrets when I climbed into the attic that day. I wasn't chasing ghosts or following cryptic clues like in some movie. I just wanted a place to be alone, a place to think, to escape the boiling tension that had wrapped itself around our home like ivy choking brick. My father had been gone 6 months by then. Not gone in the poetic sense. He hadn't left us, hadn't disappeared. He died, quickly, suddenly, a heart attack while fixing the garden hose. One moment he was cursing the stubborn twist of rubber. The next he was lying on the grass, still and silent, a single bead of sweat frozen on his temple. Mom said it was quick, that he hadn't suffered. That was supposed to comfort us. It didn't. Grief didn't fall like rain. It clung like humidity. Every room was soaked with what wasn't being said. My brother stopped speaking unless absolutely necessary. My mother floated around in a ghost shell of domestic routine, and I climbed into the attic. The ladder creaked beneath me, its joints sticky from years of disuse. The air smelled like old newspapers and mothballs. I expected cobwebs, expected to find nothing more than boxes of holiday decorations and broken furniture. What I didn't expect was the photo album. It was beneath a stack of yellowed linens, as if someone had wanted to hide it without making the effort to bury it completely. Leather bound, cracked at the spine, the color faded to a dull brown that once might have been red. It didn't look like much. It looked like 100 other family albums. But when I opened it, my skin prickled. There were pictures of my father, younger than I'd ever seen him, smiling in a way he never did in the last few years. Smiling not with his mouth but with his eyes. And beside him, a woman I didn't recognize. Not my mother. Not anyone I'd ever seen in family reunions or heard stories about. She had long, dark hair and a crooked smile, one front tooth slightly overlapping the other. Her arm was always around him in the pictures. They looked inseparable. My heart beat faster. I flipped through the pages rapidly, half expecting the woman to age into my mother's face. But she didn't. Page after page, she was there. Sometimes alone with my father. Sometimes holding a baby I didn't recognize. I stopped breathing. At first, I thought maybe it was my imagination. A cousin, perhaps. Some friend of the family I never knew. But then, midway through the album, I found a newspaper clipping folded between 2 pages. It was brittle with age, the ink smudged but legible. An engagement announcement, Jonathan Ray and Marlene Hartley. My father's name, not my mother's. The dated June 1987, 2 years before my parents got married. My hands trembled. My stomach turned cold. Who was Marlene? Why had Dad never mentioned her? And why did this album feel like something no one wanted me to find? I took it downstairs, quietly, slipping past my mother who was folding laundry like a machine, eyes glazed and mechanical. I hid the album under my bed, heart racing, ears hot. That night, sleep evaded me. I stared at the ceiling, retracing every memory of my father, every story he'd ever told. There weren't many. He wasn't a man who talked about the past. Focus on what's ahead, he'd say. The past doesn't need us digging it up. It felt like a warning now, a rule, and I had just broken it. The next morning, I skipped school. Said I had a headache. My mother didn't argue. She barely noticed. I waited until she left for groceries before pulling the album out again. This time, I studied each photo, noticed the small details. A silver locket around Marlene's neck, a cabin in the background of several shots, a child, maybe 2 years old, wearing a red jacket with a bear embroidered on the chest. I flipped back to the engagement article. The local newspaper. I searched the name of the town in our family computer. A place only 2 hours away. I dug deeper. And then I found it, a small obituary from 1992. Marlene Hartley, Ray, 29, survived by her daughter, Leah. No mention of my father. No mention of what happened. It felt like I was stepping into someone else's life. Like my father had lived an entire chapter before ours began, a chapter he'd ripped out and burned. But ashes don't always disappear. Some float. Some settle into corners you don't clean often enough. I couldn't ask him. I couldn't ask Mom either. What would I say? Hey, did Dad have a secret family before us? No, I had to know more before confronting anyone, so I made a decision. One that felt both thrilling and terrifying. I was going to that town. Alone. I took a bus. Told my brother I was at a friend's house. Told Mom I had a group project. No one questioned me. No one noticed. The town was quiet, the kind of place where time seemed slower, where people nodded at strangers and dogs slept in storefront doorways. I walked to the library, asked the local historian, an old woman with thick glasses and thicker eyebrows, if she remembered Marlene Hartley. Her eyes narrowed. She pulled out a thin drawer of index cards, flicked through them. Heartily, Marlene, oh yes. Tragic thing. Died in a fire, poor girl. Lived out on Mason Hill Road. Her little girl survived, thank God. I asked if anyone still lived there. She shook her head. House is gone now. But the daughter, Lee, she's still around. Works at the diner, I think. The diner sat at the edge of town. A bell jingled as I walked in. Vinyl booths, checkered floor, the smell of coffee and bacon. A young woman wiped down a counter, her back to me. She turned when she heard the bell. My heart stopped. She looked like my brother. Same eyes, same jawline. She couldn't have been more than a few years older than me. Her name tag read, Lee. My mouth went dry. I ordered coffee I didn't drink. Watched her move. Thought about the baby in the red jacket. Thought about the arm around my father. When she brought the check, I thanked her. She smiled politely. That same crooked tooth. I left at 20 and walked out into the sun, which suddenly felt too bright, too intrusive. On the ride back home, I tried to make sense of it all. I didn't know what it meant yet. But I knew one thing for certain: my family wasn't what I thought it was. The roots were deeper, twisted, intertwined with stories never told, choices never explained, and I had only just begun to dig. I returned home changed, though I did everything I could not to show it. I slipped through the front door as though I'd only been gone a couple of hours, not long enough to make anyone suspicious. My mother was exactly where I left her, sitting at the kitchen table, a crossword puzzle in front of her, pen in hand but unmoving. Her gaze drifted to me and then away again like I was a passing thought. I mumbled something about the group project, that it went well, that I was tired. She nodded absently and returned to her puzzle, even though she hadn't written a single word. I went upstairs and locked my bedroom door, slid the photo album out from under my bed, and stared at it like it owed me answers. I had a sister, a real flesh and blood sister who made perfect strangers feel like mirrors. And no one had ever told me. It wasn't just the secrecy that haunted me, it was the precision of it. The way this entire chapter of my father's life had been carved out with surgical care, hidden so well that I'd gone nearly 17 years without even a hint. What kind of man could do that? What kind of woman could help him keep it buried? Questions curled around each other in my mind, knotted and dense. Why hadn't Marlene been mentioned at the funeral? Why had Mom never slipped, even once, in all the late-night conversations, in all the holiday stories, in all the passive remarks about before you were born? I thought about Lee in that diner, wiping down counters like she didn't carry the weight of a secret half-sibling sitting 3 feet away. Did she even know about me? Had anyone told her? Or had our father died without ever speaking a word of our existence to her? I needed more. The photo album had given me a map, but now I needed the details, the landmarks, the missing pages. I waited until nightfall and then tiptoed into the hallway. The floorboards moaned under my feet, but no one stirred. I reached the end of the hall, turned the doorknob to the master bedroom, my mother's room now. It smelled faintly of her perfume and something else. Old fabric, faded memories. Her dresser drawers were neat, military, like in their precision. I wasn't sure what I expected to find. Another album, letters, a diary. Something that would tell me she knew. Or worse, that she had no idea at all. In the bottom drawer, beneath a pile of winter scarves, I found a shoebox. Unmarked, taped at the edges like it had been opened and resealed many times. My fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside were envelopes, dozens of them, all addressed in my father's handwriting. None of them had stamps. They weren't meant to be sent, just written. I pulled out the top one, the flap worn soft from being opened again and again. The date was 3 years before I was born. Marlene, I'm sorry for missing Lee's birthday. Work's been complicated. I hope she liked the teddy bear. I picked it myself. Tell her I'm proud of her. Tell her I miss her. Tell her I'm trying. Each letter was a piece of him I'd never seen. Regretful, conflicted, desperate. There were no grand declarations, no soap opera confessions, just fragments of a man struggling to live 2 lives. Some letters were angry, like he was writing to someone who wouldn't listen. Others were pleading, like he was writing to someone he feared he'd lose. The last letter was dated 6 months before he died. Leah's almost grown now. I wonder if she still has that red jacket. You remember the one? She used to wear it everywhere. God, I miss those days. I miss us. I miss who I was with you. Maybe one day after I'm gone they'll understand. Maybe that's the only way this ends, with truth. I put the letters back and re-sealed the box. My hands were shaking. My father hadn't been a stranger to me, but he hadn't been whole either. I'd only known the edited version, the version who came home for dinner and watched TV in silence, who fixed things around the house but rarely spoke more than a sentence. I had always thought he was just quiet. Now I knew he was haunted. The next morning, I skipped school again. This time, I went to the public records office. I needed to see the fire report, the one that killed Marlene. The clerk behind the desk was bored and unbothered. Didn't even look at me twice when I said I was researching for a school project. The report was thin. A house fire caused by faulty wiring, 1 fatality. A woman asleep on the 2nd floor. The daughter was found outside by a neighbor, crying, clutching a stuffed bear. That image stuck with me more than anything. Leah, barely 4 years old, holding on to the one thing her father had managed to give her. The last thing he gave her, maybe? The report didn't mention him. Of course it didn't. By then, he was already disappearing from that part of his life. Moving on. Moving toward us. Did he watch the flames from afar? Did he grieve in silence, bury her with no one knowing? Was that why he was always so quiet on Christmas? Why he stared at birthday candles like they were lit for someone else? I couldn't hold it in anymore. That night, I confronted my mother. I didn't plan what to say. The words just poured out. The album, the letters. Lee, everything. She didn't interrupt. She just listened. Her face didn't twist into shock or anger. It went still, pale, like she'd been expecting this moment for years. When I finally stopped gasping, my heart ready to tear through my chest, she said only one thing. I told him we'd never speak of her. She made tea, though neither of us drank it. The cup in her hand steamed between her fingers untouched. She told me everything, or at least her side of it. She met my father after Marlene's death. He was grieving lost. He hadn't told her the whole truth, not at first. Just pieces. That he'd been engaged once, that she'd died tragically, that he had no one left. It wasn't until after they were married, after my brother was born, that she found out about Lee. A child he'd abandoned, or tried not to. He sent money, gifts, but he never visited. It would have torn us apart, she said. I asked him to choose, and he chose us. I wanted to scream, to cry, to say she had no right. That Lee was innocent, that I had been robbed of a sister, a whole dimension of my own identity. But what came out was something else entirely. I need to meet her again. She needs to know. Mom didn't argue. Maybe she understood, or maybe she was just too tired. She looked at me with the kind of sadness that wasn't new, the kind that had been growing roots for years. Just be careful, she said. She might not want any of this. I waited a week before going back. This time, I brought one of the letters, one with a drawing my dad had made in the corner, a goofy cartoon bear wearing a party hat. I waited until her shift was over, stood outside the diner like a nervous ghost. When she came out, she saw me instantly. I handed her the envelope. Didn't say a word. She opened it slowly, cautiously. Her eyes scanned the letter, then stopped. She looked at me, then back at the letter. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She just whispered, "I knew he hadn't forgotten me." And then she said, "You look like him?" We sat on the curb, two strangers held together by invisible thread. We talked for hours. About nothing. About everything. She didn't hate him. That was the strangest part. She resented him, yes, but she understood something I hadn't yet. That people are complicated. That choices are rarely black and white. That secrets don't always come from malice, they come from fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Leah reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph. It was creased, worn thin at the edges. Our father, holding her as a baby, both of them laughing. "I used to think I made that memory up," she said. "But it was real." I thought of the photo album, the attic, the dust, the silence that lived between our walls. Some truths rot in darkness. Others bloom when finally unearthed. I didn't know what would come next. But I knew the story wasn't over. Not for me. Not for Lee. Not for the family we never knew we had. They say grief comes in waves, but no one warns you that truth does too. And when both collide, it's like drowning in a storm that never ends. After I met Lee, something shifted inside me. The ground I walked on no longer felt like the floor of my childhood home. It felt like the ashes of someone else's life, still warm from secrets buried too shallow. I went back home that night changed again, but in a different way than before. The first time it was confusion, the aching need to understand. This time it was rage. Quiet rage, the kind that smolders behind your ribs and makes your skin too tight to wear. The house felt smaller, even though nothing had changed. My brother still sat in front of the television with blank eyes. My mother still floated room to room like a ghost rehearsing routines from a life that no longer existed. But now every object screamed with double meaning. The photos on the wall, smiling faces framed in lies. The dining room table, 4 chairs, but only 3 were ever filled. Even the smell of my father's old collard that lingered faintly in the hallway began to feel like manipulation, like he was still trying to charm us from beyond the grave into believing in the version of himself he'd carefully curated. I couldn't keep it to myself. I had to tell someone, but not just anyone. I needed someone who'd understand the magnitude of it. And that meant telling my brother. He was in the garage when I found him, sitting on a folding chair, staring at the workbench where our father had once spent entire weekends tinkering with broken things he never seemed to finish fixing. I sat down next to him, holding the photo album like a weapon and the shoebox of letters like a key. He glanced at them without interest at first, but something in my face must have changed his posture. He sat straighter, more alert. I told him everything. Not just the facts, but how it felt. How Lee's face had been like staring into a reflection I hadn't known existed. How our father had lived a parallel life before us, a different identity with its own love, its own tragedy, its own child. How it was all hidden in this house like landmines waiting to be stepped on. My brother didn't speak for a long time. He just stared at the wall, his jaw working like he was chewing on thoughts too large to swallow. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "So we're not who we thought we were." That single sentence hit harder than I expected. Because it wasn't just about our father, or even Lee. It was about the very foundation of who we believed ourselves to be. Our last name, our family dinners, our childhood memories. They weren't lies. But they weren't the full truth either. They were built on edited history, on choices made by a man we trusted to be honest with us. And now, the edits were showing. My brother took the album from me, flipping slowly through the pages, stopping at the photo of our father and Marlene at the cabin. "He looks happy," he muttered. Like, really happy. I knew what he meant. It wasn't a happiness we'd seen often. Our father had been a good man by most definitions. He worked hard, paid bills, never raised a hand or his voice. But happiness. that had always seemed like something he visited, not lived in. Now we knew why. Part of him had been buried long before his body ever was. We decided to visit the cabin. It was a long shot, but it appeared in enough photos to suggest it had mattered. Something about it pulled at me, like a place frozen in amber, untouched by time or truth. After some digging, I found a rental agreement tucked into one of the letters. The address was barely legible, scrawled in faded ink, but it was there. Tucked into a corner of the state, deep in the woods. We took my brother's car. Didn't tell Mom, didn't need to. She'd stopped asking where we were going or why. Maybe she knew. Maybe she didn't want to. Either way, she didn't stop us. The drive was long and silent, the kind of silence that hangs heavy, not awkward but weighty, full of things that no one knows how to say yet. Trees grew taller the farther we went, swallowing the road in green shadows. The GPS cut out 10 miles before the turnoff. We followed the directions from the letter after that. Turn left at the rusted mailbox. Take the dirt path past the creek. Look for the red tin roof. We found it. The cabin was still standing. Barely. Time had not been kind. The porch sagged, the steps creaked dangerously under our weight, and the windows were dust-filmed and cracked. But it was real. Tangible. A place that had once held laughter and love, and probably pain too. My brother and I walked through the threshold together, neither of us speaking, both of us reverent in the presence of this forgotten shrine to a life we'd never been part of. Inside, it was like time had stopped. Dust covered everything, but it wasn't abandoned. There were books on the shelves, toys in a bin near the fireplace, a coffee mug with "World's Best Dad" written in faded letters. The air smelled of cedar and decay, like memory itself. On the mantel above the fire was a single framed photo, our father, Marlene, and baby Lee. I reached out and touched the frame. It was cold, heavy. I turned it over. On the back, in his handwriting, were the words, "My real beginning." My breath caught. It confirmed everything and yet added another layer of grief. We hadn't been his beginning. We were the sequel, maybe even the epilogue. That one phrase rewrote my entire understanding of my place in his life. Did he love us less? Was his heart always half elsewhere? I couldn't decide which answer hurt more. We stayed there for hours, exploring every room, every drawer. In the bedroom, we found another box, smaller. It contained more letters, these from Marlene to him. Some were never opened, others had tears dried into the paper. One stuck out more than the others. The envelope was marked, "In case of goodbye." We read it together. She knew she was going to die, not in the sense of premonition, but in the wary, instinctive sense that comes when something feels wrong for too long. She wrote about her fears, about the creaking wires, about the way the lights flickered even after repairs. She asked him to take care of Lee if anything happened. Begged him not to let her disappear into the system. Said she didn't trust anyone else. He never did. Or maybe he tried and failed. Or maybe he thought staying away was some twisted form of protection. Whatever his reasoning, the reality was clear: he hadn't done what she asked. My brother folded the letter, eyes wet but unblinking. He had one job, he whispered. And he didn't finish it, I thought. Not fully. He tried in his way. Letters, money, gifts. But none of those things replace presence. None of them fill the hole left by a missing parent. On the way home, we didn't speak much. The silence was different this time. Not empty, but full. A silence filled with processing, with the slow digestion of a truth too big to chew all at once. I felt heavier but clearer, like something had settled into place. Not peace exactly, but understanding. When we pulled into the driveway, Mom was waiting on the porch. Her face unreadable. She didn't ask where we'd been. Just looked at us and said, "Did you find what you were looking for?" I didn't know how to answer. How do you explain that what we found wasn't a place or a person, but a fracture in time? A fracture that explains everything that ever felt off, but never had a name. We nodded. That was enough for her. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifting like waves above me. In my mind, I saw Leah again, wiping counters, holding her father's letter, whispering I knew he hadn't forgotten me. I saw the photo above the fireplace. The handwritten words, my real beginning. I thought of my mother's face when I told her. The exhaustion, the resignation, the fear. It hit me then. I wasn't the only one grieving the man we thought we knew. She had spent her entire marriage trying to hold on to someone who had already let go of something he never truly replaced. My brother had spent his life imitating a father whose full shape he never saw. Leah had spent her life wondering if she'd ever mattered. None of us knew him completely. But together, we formed the puzzle. Each of us held a piece. And now it was time to fit them together, or let them fall apart. I didn't realize how deeply secrets could infect silence until the night I heard my mother crying through the wall. Not sobbing, not wailing. Just the kind of quiet, restrained weeping that sounds like someone trying not to exist. It came in small bursts, muffled by the thin plaster between our bedrooms, and I laid there listening, still as death, staring at the ceiling like I'd somehow conjured it. It wasn't the first time I'd heard her like that since Dad passed, but it was the first time I understood why the silence in our house felt so heavy. It was soaked in things we were all too afraid to say. But the truth doesn't wait for permission. It demands to be reckoned with. The next day, Leah called. Her voice was tentative, lighter than I expected. She asked if we could meet again. I didn't hesitate. We chose a park halfway between our towns. Neutral ground. When I got there, she was already sitting on a bench beneath a cluster of red oaks, a coffee in one hand, a folded piece of paper in the other. When I sat down beside her, she passed me the paper without a word. It was a birth certificate. Her birth certificate. Under Feather's name, it read, Jonathan Ray. My father, no middle, initial, no ambiguity. It was official, undeniable, printed in ink darker than anything we'd ever been told. I found it in my mother's old files, she said. She kept everything. Insurance forms, doctor records, even receipts for my baby clothes. But this I didn't expect. I stared at the document, feeling like I was holding a bomb too delicate to drop, but too powerful to keep. Her voice softened. I always hoped he'd claimed me somewhere. I guess this means he did. At least once. I wanted to tell her how many times I'd dreamed of having a sister when I was younger, how I used to imagine a sibling who understood things the way I did. Not the surface, level bond I had with my brother, but a mirror of the internal chaos, the hunger for more. Now here she was, sitting inches away, and it felt both perfectly natural and deeply wrong. Natural because something in me recognized her already. Wrong because I'd been denied this connection for most of my life. We talked for hours again, this time more openly. She told me what her life was like after Marlene died. Foster homes, a brief stint with an aunt who couldn't handle a grieving child, then finally adoption at age 6 by a couple who couldn't have kids of their own. They were kind, she said. Steady. But she always knew something was missing. That some part of her had been paused, waiting for answers. She'd looked into her mother's past once she turned 18, found fragments, articles, obituaries, even a wedding photo, but she had no way of reaching my father. He'd moved on so cleanly, like he'd vanished. That hurt me more than I expected. I'd come to see him not just as my father, but as a man fractured by loss, doing the best he could with broken tools. But now, hearing Lee's version, the man I wanted to defend felt harder to find. He'd made her into a ghost, and then he'd taught us to forget ghosts existed. When I got home, I found my brother waiting in my room. He'd pulled more boxes from the attic. Things I hadn't noticed, hadn't thought to dig through. There were old videotapes, labeled in Dad's handwriting. 1989, summer trip, Marlene's birthday. Lee, first steps. I felt a tremor pass through me. These weren't family videos we'd ever watched. They were relics of the other life, the one hidden beneath ours. He held one up. We still have the player in the basement, he said. We hooked it up in silence. The screen flickered to life. Static gave way to a grainy image of a young woman laughing in a kitchen. Marlene, Her movements were light, chaotic, like she was dancing through domesticity. The camera turned and we saw Dad, our dad, smiling, genuinely smiling. He looked younger, freer. Then Leah toddled into the frame, barely walking, holding a spatula like it was a toy. They both laughed. My father bent down and scooped her up, spinning her in his arms. "There's my girl," he said, voice thick with pride. My brother turned to me, jaw clenched. Why didn't he keep this somewhere else? Why hide it right above our heads? I didn't have an answer. Maybe part of him wanted to be found. Maybe he left breadcrumbs in case he never got the courage to tell us. Or maybe it was guilt, burying the evidence but not destroying it. We watched 3 tapes that night, each more painful than the last. It felt like we were spying on ghosts. A family that wasn't ours, but should have been. The part that destroyed me most was hearing my father's voice in a tone I'd never heard growing up. Soft, warm, effortlessly joyful. I realized he'd never spoken to me that way. Not once. Later, alone in my room, I stared at the ceiling and let a new kind of grief take over. Not for the man I'd lost, but for the man I never really had. The next day, my brother and I told Mom about the tapes. She didn't react the way I thought she would. No rage. No breakdown. She simply said, "I knew they were there." I asked him to get rid of them. He said he couldn't. She looked down at her hands, pale against her teacup. So I told him to put them somewhere I wouldn't find them. I didn't want to watch someone else's happiness. I didn't know whether to comfort her or be furious. I wanted to scream that those weren't just tapes. They were pieces of us too. They were proof of our roots. But I also saw her pain. She hadn't just competed with a memory, she'd lived in its shadow every day, knowing that she had come second, even if he never said it out loud. She stood and opened a drawer, pulling out a small, worn notebook. This was his journal, she said, pressing it into my hands. He wrote every night. I never read it. I couldn't. But maybe you should. But that night, I read until my eyes burned. The entries started in 1987, the same year he and Marlene were engaged. It read like a love letter to a life that kept slipping through his fingers. Pages upon pages of joy, confusion, anger, guilt. Then the entry on the night Marlene died. July 18, 1992, the fire started just after midnight. I wasn't there. I should have been. God help me, I should have been. She called that afternoon, said the lights were acting up again. I told her I'd come by next week. Just one more week. But she's gone? My Leah is all that's left. I watched the house burn from my car. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't run in. I didn't move. I couldn't save her. When the ambulance came, I drove away. Like a coward, like a stranger. I've been running ever since. I closed the notebook with trembling hands. He'd watched. He'd been there. He saw the fire and still left. That image seared itself into my mind, more vivid than anything else. The fire wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. It consumed her, and it consumed him. But he didn't die in that fire. He came back to us, built a new life, smiled at school plays, shoveled snow, paid bills. But the man who did those things was already ashes. In the final entry written weeks before his death, he said something I'll never forget. There's no way to be two people. I've tried. I thought I could carry both lives, but they kept pulling me apart. I loved them both. God help me, I did. But love divided isn't enough. Not when the past keeps burning. That was when I knew what I had to do. I called Lee. Told her about the tapes, the journal, the cabin, everything. And I invited her over. Not to my room, not to a park, to the house. The one built on silence. She paused, then said, "Okay, but only if your mom is okay with it." But the hardest conversation of my life followed. I asked Mom to meet her, not for me, not for Dad, but for herself, to see the full picture, to release the years of imagined betrayal and let the truth breathe, no matter how painful. She hesitated, she cried. Then, quietly, she agreed. When Leah arrived, everything felt fragile, like the air itself might shatter. But Mom opened the door. She looked at Leah, and something shifted in her eyes. Not shock, not anger, recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from years of trying not to remember a face you never forgot. "You have his eyes," she whispered. Lee nodded. "So do your children." And just like that, the room exhaled. Not peace. Not forgiveness, but a first breath. The beginning of something none of us knew how to name yet. A family, maybe. Or at least, the ruins of one we could start rebuilding. There was a strange silence in the house the day Lee came for dinner. Not the silence of secrets or avoidance like before, but a new kind of stillness. Expectant. Fragile. Like the pause before a long breath when the world holds its inhale to see if things might turn out differently this time. We cleaned everything. My mother rearranged the living room furniture as though angling a chair a few inches to the left might somehow steer conversation in a better direction. My brother shaved, which he never did unless someone died or someone came back to life. And I? Well, I just sat on the stairs, clutching the last of Dad's journals and wondering how the man who built this house had managed to live 100 lives in one skin. Leah arrived right at 6. She brought flowers. That single gesture cracked something open in my mother's expression. She took them with a nod that looked like it might fall apart at the edges if you stared too long. I watched them move through the rituals, greeting, seating, offering drinks, and every motion felt loaded, rehearsed from muscle memory, but haunted by the knowledge that this scene wasn't supposed to exist. A daughter meeting the woman who had unknowingly replaced her mother. A mother hosting the child her husband never mentioned. And my brother and I, sitting in the middle of it all like witnesses to a trial that had been postponed for 17 years. Dinner was quiet at first. Chicken, potatoes, roasted carrots. Forks clinked, water glasses refilled. My mother asked about Lee's job, her apartment, her adoptive family. Lee answered carefully, her voice composed, but there was a tension in her throat like she was balancing on a wire. Then my brother spoke about the tapes, the ones we'd watched late into the night. The way Dad had laughed, the way he'd held her like a man trying to memorize a moment forever. Lee nodded slowly. "He was good to me until he wasn't there anymore." My mother looked down. "He was never good at staying," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The air froze. It was the first real truth spoken aloud that night, and it changed everything. Suddenly, the conversation stopped being polite. It started being real. Lee set her fork down. "I always told myself he had no choice, that something forced him away. But he did choose, over and over." But my mother's eyes stayed on her plate. "He did," she said, "but that doesn't mean he didn't love you." Leah's face softened just slightly. "He wrote to me, you know, after the fire. Every year on my birthday I got a package. Books, always without a return address. I figured it was him. The handwriting was always the same, but I never knew if it meant anything." "It did," I said, reaching under the table and pulling out the box of letters. "He kept everything. He wrote to you even when he didn't send them." She took the box with trembling hands, opened it, and pulled one letter free. Her lips moved silently as she read, tears forming in her eyes like dew. "He remembered the beer," she whispered, "the one from the fire. We sat like that for a long time. No one rushed. No one interrupted. Just silence, honest this time, the kind that follows a wound being exposed to air." After dinner, we moved to the living room. My brother set up the old tape player again. This time, Leah sat between us. My mother stayed in the kitchen, pretending to clean, but I saw her glancing in through the doorway. The screen flickered, and there they were. Marlene, Dad, baby Lee in the backyard under a sprinkler. He chased her, arms outstretched, laughing in a way that didn't feel like performance. It felt like peace, like belonging. And watching it now, beside the girl who should have grown up in that laugh, I felt the full ache of what had been lost. "I loved you," I said to Lee. She nodded, but her smile was cracked. But love didn't save us. The next week, everything changed. It started with a phone call. My mother dialing Marlene's sister. Someone we'd never met, someone she hadn't spoken to since the funeral. They talked for nearly an hour. When she hung up, her face was pale but calm. "She's willing to meet," she said. Said it's about time. Then my brother started building a digital archive. Scanning letters, photos, old journal pages, a living memory. He called it something for Lee, something for us, something that told the full story, unredacted, unpolished. And me? I went back to the attic. There was one box I hadn't opened yet. It was tucked in the far corner, beneath an old quilt and a stack of unused wallpaper rolls, smaller than the others, unlabeled. Inside, I found a collection of cassette tapes. Audio diaries, it turned out. Dad's voice, recorded late at night. I listened to the first one alone, headphones pressed tight, afraid the words might slip out and disappear if I didn't hold them close. March 3, 1996. It's been 4 years since the fire. I dreamed of her again last night. She was sitting on the porch, barefoot, reading that terrible romance novel she used to make fun of. Lee was drawing chalk hearts on the steps. I tried to walk toward them, but the closer I got, the farther they moved. I woke up sweating. Anna doesn't know. She thinks it's stress. Maybe it is. Maybe I'm just haunted. Some days I feel like I live 2 lives, both half true. One with ghosts, one with guilt. Neither feels like home. I listen to every tape. Hours of confessions, contradictions, quiet apologies into the void. In one, he talked about my brother's birth. How it broke him in a new way. How holding a second child made him realize just how much he'd lost with the first. How love wasn't finite, but regret was. He never had a plan. That much was clear. He just kept moving forward and backward at the same time, hoping the 2 halves of his soul would eventually stop tearing him apart. But they didn't. They couldn't. And now that task had fallen to us, to find the pieces, to hold them together without cracking ourselves in the process. The night after I finished the tapes, I invited Lee to the attic. It felt only right to bring her where it had all started for me. We sat among the dust and insulation, surrounded by the objects of his past, the ones he couldn't let go of and the ones we couldn't pretend didn't exist anymore. She ran her hands over the old quilt. "Did he ever talk about me? To you?" "Never," I said. "But now I think he talked about you all the time, just not out loud." She nodded, staring at the ceiling. "I wonder what he'd say if he saw this. Us, together." "He'd say nothing," I replied. "But he'd write about it later." We laughed. Tired, thin, but real. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something new, a framed photo. It was the one we'd seen in the cabin, of her as a baby in his arms. "I want this here," she said. "Not in a box. On the wall, with the rest of the family." And so we did. We made space for her in our home, in our history. We rearranged the photos in the hallway. We added names to the family tree my brother had once made for a school project, taping on a branch where one had always been missing. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't clean. But it was truth. For the first time, our house felt honest. Some nights, my mother would sit with Lee and listen to the tapes. Other times, my brother would cook for all of us, experimenting with recipes from Marlene's old notebook, which Lee had found buried in a storage bin. We shared memories like puzzle pieces, fitting them together not to complete a picture, but to acknowledge that one existed at all. We stopped asking why Dad had done what he did. We started asking how we could do better. The hardest part was realizing that closure isn't something you find. It's something you create. Not by forgetting, but by remembering fully, without edits, without shame. Love doesn't erase mistakes. It lives alongside them like candlelight against the shadow of everything we wish had gone differently. And in that flickering light, a family was being reborn. Not the one we started with, but maybe, just maybe, the one we were always meant to be. Grief has a way of changing shape. It starts out loud, wailing in the dark, clawing through your chest, dragging your breath into the undertow. But if you survive it long enough, it becomes quieter. It stops screaming and starts whispering, curling itself into your rituals, your routines. It learns to speak your language. Sometimes, it even wears your smile. In the months after we hung Lee's photo on the wall, That's exactly what happened. The house didn't heal overnight, but it breathed differently. The silence that once smothered the walls began to loosen, making room for new echoes. Not laughter, not yet, but something close. Something like truth humming low in the floorboards. Something like belonging. The photo album stayed on the coffee table now. No longer a secret tucked away in the attic. It had become a centerpiece. Guests would glance at it, assuming it was just a family keepsake. Some of them would flip through its pages, smiling politely at pictures they couldn't place, not knowing that every image was loaded with buried time. And we let them, because hiding it again would have meant pretending that part of us didn't exist. That Lee didn't exist. And we'd done enough pretending. She came every Sunday after that first dinner. It became tradition. She'd bring something. Flowers, pie. Once even an old board game from her childhood she swore Dad used to play with her. My mother would always act indifferent about it, but I caught the way her fingers lingered on the petals, the way she sliced the pie too neatly, like trying to honor the effort without admitting how much it meant. My brother opened up faster. He and Lee clicked in ways I hadn't expected, shared sarcasm, inside jokes that formed almost immediately, as though their blood recognized each other before their minds caught up. Watching them was like watching a time lapse of a tree growing where there had only been soil. Something dormant now sprouting. But even as new roots took hold, the past wasn't done with us yet. It came back in a letter, delivered in a plain white envelope, addressed in blocky handwriting to my mother. It was from Marlene's sister, Elaine, the one she'd spoken to once on the phone. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a photograph. The photo showed our father at a hospital, sitting beside a woman in a hospital bed. Her face was pale, gaunt, but her eyes were alight with something fierce. In her arms, a newborn. On the back, in blue, Lee, April 2, 1990. The letter was brief. I thought you should have this. I've carried it long enough. I don't know if it brings comfort or makes things worse. But it's truth. And that should belong to all of you now. My mother showed it to me in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly. He was there, she whispered. He was there when she was born. Her voice cracked, and she folded the paper like it might break. I told myself for years that he never fully belonged to her life, that I had the best of him. But maybe I was wrong. Maybe I just had the rest of him. I didn't know what to say. There were no lines left to draw between right and wrong, betrayal and forgiveness. The timeline didn't matter anymore. The truth was already here, woven into everything. We weren't trying to protect the past. We were trying to survive it. We framed the photo, hung it next to the one of her as a toddler, next to ours, our wall of truths. I called it that now, quietly, to myself. It wasn't decoration. It was a monument. Proof that he'd existed in all these different lives, in all these different versions, and that we, fractured, tangled, rearranged, were the continuation of those stories. The next ripple came at Thanksgiving. We invited Elaine. It was Lee's idea, and to everyone's surprise, my mother agreed without hesitation. Maybe she was tired of fences. Maybe she wanted to see who had held her husband's first life in her hands. Elaine arrived with a bottle of wine and an entire tray of sweet potatoes, and within minutes, she had everyone laughing with stories about Marlene's terrible fashion sense and Lee's obsession with bugs as a kid. You ate a worm once, she told Lee. Whole. Didn't even chew. Leah rolled her eyes. Why do you always bring that up? Because it's hilarious, sweetheart. You cried after because it didn't taste like chocolate. The laughter was sharp and strange at first, like we weren't used to how it felt in our mouths anymore. But it stuck around. It echoed. Even my mother laughed, her shoulders loosening, her eyes softening when Elaine brought up a story about my father singing Elvis songs off key to a baby Lee in the bath. That night, after everyone left, my mother sat on the porch alone. I joined her, wrapped in a blanket, the air crisp and smelling faintly of wood smoke. He really did love her, didn't he? She said quietly. Wes, I answered. There was no resentment in her voice, just a quiet reckoning. He loved me, too, she added. But I don't think he ever figured out how to forgive himself. Though we sat in silence, the stars watching from above. I think he was waiting for someone else to fix it all, I said. But no one did. So now we're the ones fixing it. But my mother looked at me, her face tired but gentle. Then maybe we should stop fixing and just start living. A few weeks later, we did something we'd never done before. We took a trip. All of us. My mother, my brother, Leah, and me. Back to the cabin. We hadn't touched it since that first visit, but this time we brought tools, paint, supplies. We didn't try to restore it completely. Just enough to honor it. We fixed the sagging porch. We painted the shutters a soft green. Inside, we dusted the shelves, replaced the broken chairs, put fresh linens on the beds. It wasn't just a structure anymore. It was a symbol, a bridge between the life that had been and the life we were building now. Lee brought the old drawing she'd done as a kid. Hearts in chalk, copied from a photo, and framed it above the fireplace. My brother found a box of Dad's old shirts in the attic and turned them into a quilt. We laid it across the couch like a flag of truce. My mother brought nothing, but she stayed, and that was enough. The last night we spent there, the four of us sat around the fire pit outside, wrapped in jackets, sipping hot chocolate. No one spoke for a while. We just watched the flames crackle, sending sparks into the dark like stars being born. Then Lee said, "You know, I used to wonder if I'd ever feel like I belonged to someone. To anyone. I used to think I was just a leftover." Boss, she looked at each of us. "But not anymore. I don't feel like a leftover. I feel placed, like the last piece in a puzzle." And my mother reached over and took her hand. "You were never a leftover," she said. "You were just a part of the story we hadn't reached yet." I think that was the moment it all came together. Not in a perfect, tied-up way, but in the real way. Messy, raw, human. The photo album, the letters, the tapes, the journals. They weren't just evidence of the past. They were maps. And we had followed them through grief and anger and silence, through blood and fire and truth. We had followed them to each other, and we weren't lost anymore. Back home, we started planning a new tradition. An annual gathering at the cabin. A weekend where we'd remember not just who we lost, but what we found. Where new stories would be told and old ones honored. Where Leah would bring her future children. Where my brother and I would build new walls from old beams. Where my mother would finally rest not in denial, but in acceptance. We kept the album on the table. We added new pages. Photos of Thanksgiving of the cabin, of all of us on the porch steps. Together whole, even if the pieces didn't always match. The truth, once buried in dust, now sat open for anyone to see. Because some stories don't end with a twist. Some end with a choice. To remember, to forgive, to rebuild. And in doing so, to finally become the family we never knew we already were. Thanks for watching the video. Subscribe and like the video.